I mean, what he's not seeking to do here, I think, is to find a compromise over Ukraine's statehood or its ability to choose its alliances or to choose its destination. What he's looking to do here is achieve a deal directly with Mr. Trump that recognizes Russia's interests as Mr. Putin sees them, which are frankly incompatible with the interests of Ukraine as a fully functioning democratic sovereign state, or I would say with our own security here in the UK.
From the Times, this is The World in 10. Our guest today is Sir Laurie Bristow, a long-time British diplomat who was ambassador to Moscow. Laurie, welcome.
Hello.
So we've seen more than 4 hours of talks today between the US and Russia. One Russian negotiator says they went well. What's your view of what the Kremlin's calculations were? What were their purpose going into these negotiations?
Well, obviously, everybody's going to be very tight-lipped at this stage, so I wouldn't expect to see a lot of information come out for a while yet. But I think the most important quotation I've seen from any of the participants so far is from Yuri Ushakov. That's Mr. Putin's foreign policy advisor, a real veteran of the scene in Moscow. What he said was that the two sides agreed to take each other's interests into account and to develop their bilateral relations. I think that's a pretty good guide to what the Kremlin will have been looking for going into the talks in the first place. And I think the fact of the talks themselves, and that this is about the leadership in Moscow talking directly with the leadership in the United States, is telling us all that we need to know about what the Kremlin's objectives here really are.
One man who wasn't there, as you say, the leadership of Vladimir Putin, not in Riyadh, he looms large over these talks. What do you think he's seeking from this negotiation?
Well, you certainly wouldn't expect Mr. Putin or Mr. Trump to start out with a face-to-face meeting, and there needs to be preparation of the ground, as always, in these kinds of things. But the most important thing of all for Mr. Putin in all of this been establishing two things. One is that whatever happens in Ukraine, or indeed more widely, is essentially decided between the big boys, between the President of the United States and the President of Russia. Nobody else gets a look in on that. Not the Ukrainians, not the Europeans, nobody. This is decided amongst, as the Russians understand it, the two great powers. The second thing that he's looking for here is to break out of that isolation that was imposed on Russia, on Putin and on the Kremlin, since started really going back to their annexation of Crimea in 2014 and stirring up of the war in the Donbass at that point, but particularly after the full-on invasion of 2022. What Mr. Putin is seeking to demonstrate here is that nothing can be decided, nothing can be resolved without Russia in the room.
How does Mr. Putin view Ukraine as a state? And will that affect how much he's willing to accept from any peace deal?
Yeah. Well, I think, we go back to Mr. Putin's own words on this. He doesn't consider Ukraine to be a state. He doesn't consider Mr. Zelensky to be a legitimate leader. At the end of the day, to take his own word for it, he considers Ukraine to be an anti-Russian project. There it is in his very strange essay just before the war was launched, and back in his statements all through the years on this. What he's not seeking to do here, I think, is to find a compromise over Ukraine's statehood or its ability to choose its alliances or to choose its destination. What he's looking to do here is achieve a deal directly with Mr. Trump that recognizes Russia's interests as Mr. Putin sees them, which are frankly incompatible with the interests of Ukraine as a fully functioning democratic sovereign state, or I would say with our own security here in the UK.
So he wants an end to this anti-Russian project as he sees it. Donald Trump says Vladimir Putin wants peace. Do you think that's true?
It depends what you mean by peace. I think Mr. Putin probably wants a ceasefire. Who wouldn't? This is a grotesque war. It's killed very, very large numbers of people, and I think will kill a lot more before it's over. But I think we need to be clear what Mr. Putin understands by a ceasefire. First of all, ceasefires with the Kremlin rarely involve the complete and final ceasing of fire. What we will get, whatever deal comes out of these talks or any other talks, will be a continuation of war by other means, essentially. So a constant testing of the military threshold, all the things that we should be used to by now from the way that the Kremlin exercises power in the world. We would expect the Kremlin to want the Americans particularly to lose interest in what happens in Ukraine. And he will want to be able to dial up or down the pressure on the government in Kiev, whoever that is, at will. So essentially, he'll be looking to achieve an outcome that fundamentally compromises Ukraine as a country, as a sovereign state.
As you say, the outcomes that Russia is demanding have been well signaled by Russia going back years. What does seem to be new today is Russia wanting disavowal of the road to NATO membership that was promised to Ukraine and Georgia back in 2008. There's also some suggestion that they don't mind whether Kyiv joins the EU, though. So it's the military issue there. Do you see this all as a natural progression from what the American Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said last week? That did seem to be something of a concession already over NATO membership.
First of all, let's dispose with the European Union point. For as long as I can remember, the Kremlin's signaling on this has been all over the place. Sometimes they deeply mind it, sometimes they don't. I just remind you that it was the prospect of the association agreement with the European Union in 2013, 2014 that prompted the Maidan and eventually, the annexation of Crimea and the stirring up of war in the Donbass. With regard to NATO membership, I mean, the Kremlin's position on this has been perfectly clear for a very long time. They do not want Ukraine to join NATO, full stop. They don't want NATO forces or any foreign forces in Ukraine, because what they do want at the end of the day is a demilitarized Ukraine ruled by someone who is essentially in the Kremlin's pocket, and that's what they intend to achieve over time. That, of course, is not the same thing as a Ukraine that's free to make its own sovereign choices. So what I think, I mean, it's quite easy, really, to set out what I think Mr. Putin would be looking for from any discussions with Trump. And first of all, I've already touched on it. It's face-to-face talks, demonstrating that this is something that's decided amongst the leaders of the two great powers, and nobody else is consulted on that. They want no Ukrainian membership of NATO ever. They want no US or NATO forces in Ukraine. They want recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea and as much as possible of the other 4 oblasts. But what they're also looking for is something way beyond that. So if you go back to the 2 rather strange draft treaties that the Kremlin put on the table just before the full-on invasion in the beginning of 2022, they talked essentially of winding back NATO to the 1997 limits of membership of NATO in Europe. And they essentially ask the United States, or demand of the United States, in effect, wholesale withdrawal from commitment to Europe's security. That doesn't seem to be even remotely compatible with the security interests of countries like the UK or France or Germany or Poland, or I would argue even the United States itself.
We see reports in the Times that Ukraine has refused to sign a US deal to give up hundreds of billions of dollars of mineral wealth to the Americans. Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, was at the talks. He says they discussed energy prices. How important are these kind of transactional issues for the US and for Russia?
Well, they're clearly becoming more important because of what we're starting, I think, to understand of the nature of Mr. Trump's presidency. So pretty clearly, what was put on the table or floated a few days ago between the United States and Ukraine was some kind of really transactional deal. Personally, I think that Mr. Zelensky was right, not to pick it up off the table. But the question for all of us is, knowing what we know of Mr. Trump's approach to diplomacy, approach to statecraft and view of the world, how do we engage his understanding of US interests in the things that are at stake here? With regard to Russia, I think what's happening here is something rather different. It's that Russia's economy is under really serious pressure. That doesn't mean, of course, that we should expect it to collapse anytime in 2025. It won't. And I think for as long as is relevant for these purposes, Mr. Putin will be able to go on to continue financing his war if that's what he wants to do. But I think the Russians will certainly be looking for things like sanctions relief They will be worried by any fall or pushing down of the oil price because their economy is dependent on commodities prices. And they'll be looking to break out of the straitjacket that G8-led sanctions have put Russia under since the full-on invasion in 2022.
It's 80 years ago last week since the Yalta conference in Crimea. A lot of people in Eastern Europe see that as the great carve-up agreed by Britain, Russia and US as causing many of the woes that we still have today. Are we seeing Moscow and Washington again making deals at the expense of smaller states?
That's very much the fear. And I suspect that when we look back on it, last week and this week will be one of those periods in time where the importance of what just happened will only become apparent when we see it in the rearview mirror. So the things to be really concerned about here, I mean, top of my list would be making sure that we understand in the UK why what happens in Ukraine matters directly and immediately to our security. Second, the importance of keeping the United States bound into what happens in transatlantic security. This has been the absolute bedrock of everybody's defense and security thinking, really since the end of the Second World War. It's very, very important, I think, that we have that conversation both amongst the Europeans and with our American friends. The third, and I have to say this, it's what was going on in the meeting amongst the Europeans after the Munich Security Conference. That again struck me as a very important moment where a number of things were going on. So one is that the European leaders were coming to terms with some of the signaling that they're hearing from Washington, and they're doing some signaling of their own. First of all, that we get it, that we understand that we must take our own security seriously and behave accordingly. Second, I think it's signaling to the Russians and in a different way the Ukrainians also that that's our intention. But third, it's also starting the discussion about what that actually means in terms of defense capabilities, defense planning, the budgetary implications that go with that are enormous, but also making sure that our publics understand why this is not, this really isn't optional. This is not a choice that we can either make or not make. We have to do this.
As you say, France, the UK, not at the table, despite being expected to give troops to guarantee any sort of peace. Ukraine's not at the table. Behind the scenes, what will be going on in the foreign ministries and the embassies of the countries who didn't attend the meeting in Riyadh today?
I think a lot of taking stock, a lot of planning, a lot of dialogue. That obviously is the way that the diplomacy business works. But the really important question here of all is, what are we going to do next? How do we keep the Americans bound into Europe's security? How do we push back against the view that actually this isn't a core interest for the US? I think it is, not least because I think the United States, when they think about it, they need allies. Whatever the problem is that they're trying to solve around the world. Having allies is better than not having allies. I think also there's a degree of reassurance to be given to the countries on the eastern frontier of Europe. I'm thinking particularly of Poland. So Poland now has come a long way ahead of, frankly, most NATO allies in terms of defense expenditure and capabilities. The very vulnerable countries, the three Baltic republics, who are absolutely dependent on Mr. Putin believing that NATO's Article 5 means something.
There's an argument you hear from some that Russia's war in Ukraine is actually against NATO. It just happens to have Ukraine as its battlefield. Is that an assessment you would share? And does it surprise you that Ukraine isn't represented in these talks?
Well, the fact that Ukraine isn't represented in the talks, I think, it's a deliberate decision by Mr. Putin and to some degree also by Mr. Trump. Is it about NATO? I would say it's partly about NATO, but not exclusively. Let's always go back to. We should always go back to Mr. Putin's words about this. So when he was justifying his view of Ukraine, his invasion of Ukraine, I think we should go back to what he says about Ukraine not being a proper country, about it being torn away from Russia proper. and about it being an anti-Russian project implied of the West. None of those things allow for Ukrainians themselves to exercise any choice in the matter. That is the key difference, I think, between Mr. Putin's view of the world and, frankly, that of any democratic country.
It feels a little like that Europeans are flailing a little around defense here. We're seeing differences in what they're saying publicly. We're having briefings privately. Is this natural because of how the US is approaching this process, or is this actually confusion that at its base coming out?
I think there is a fair amount of confusion. I would describe it also as coming to terms with the nature and the likely preferences of the new Trump administration. Bear in mind, that he was only inaugurated a month or so ago. Things are moving fast, and there's a lot of catching up to do. I think the key elements for this year are first of all around ensuring that we do what it takes to keep Ukraine in the fight. We're in a pre-negotiation phase. Of course, Mr. Putin's objective will be to weaken Ukraine as much as possible, as fast as possible, ahead of any substantive negotiation. There is a lot of coming to terms, I would say, with the world that we're going into, one where the Europeans need to spend more on their own defence. They need to take more responsibility for their own defence, our own defence. I include the UK in this. And we need to understand that the nature of the relationship with the President of the United States has probably changed. We don't. I don't think we can yet entirely describe what that looks like. But we've been put on notice that US priorities are not going to be in the European theatre for the foreseeable future. It doesn't mean, I think, necessarily that the US is completely pulling out its forces or its commitment to the Euro-Atlantic security region. But we do need to make that argument. We need to demonstrate to the new administration that we are taking our defence seriously and that we see what they're saying.
If, as is being signalled by the US administration, a deal could be agreed by Easter, will that be the end of it? Will that be an enduring peace for Ukraine?
I don't think there is any scenario in which there is enduring peace. I think it's possible that you could achieve a ceasefire in that timescale. But the point about a ceasefire with Mr. Putin is it's the next stage in the conflict. It doesn't resolve the underlying conflict. I don't think that the underlying conflict is resolvable because I think the underlying conflict is about Russia itself and about Mr. Putin's view of Russia's place in the world, which is, I think, a large part of what his people have been doing today in the talks with the United States. This is about demonstrating that Russia perceives itself to be a great power. Its voice, it will insist that its voice is heard. It will insist that its interests are accommodated by others. That is a zero-sum game. There is no ground for compromise with Mr. Putin over Ukraine's existence as a sovereign democratic country. He doesn't think it should exist as a country at all, let alone as a sovereign democratic one. So our choices are to try to find ways to bring the fighting to a ceasefire, but not really to give away the point of principle there.
So, Laurie Bristow, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.